Not yet.
Go right ahead. All right, test for Swampscott television. I'm hearing magnification. That's good.
Well, good evening. I'm Nancy Schultz, Chair of the Swampscott Historical Commission, and this is Molly Connor, President of the Historical Society, otherwise known as John Glover. So the Historical Society has been researching and presenting the fascinating stories of local and colonial history since 1977. He served 11 years on his town's historical commission, and he's an active volunteer with the Arlington Historical Society. He especially enjoys recovering and telling what everyone used to know, and the significance of old monuments that no one stops to look at anymore, or the broader reach of an event that we thought we knew. Michael's lectures have been in demand with the arrival of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and his depiction of the Battle of Menotomy will be featured at this summer's History Camp Boston 2025 in August. Mr. Ruderman graduated from Harvard College with a degree in history and has pursued graduate study at University of Mass Lowell. He recently published a fabulous article, you can find it online, The Forgotten Battle of Menotomy, in the spring 2025 issue of American Heritage magazine. Please give a warm Essex County welcome to Mr.
Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate being here. I caught a good story. In Arlington, we have been pursuing telling the untold stories of April 19th. Why untold? I'll get into that in a moment. And the opportunity to do a written version for American Heritage was great. If they'd given me twice as much space, I could have incorporated what I'm going to be talking about tonight. At least 701 named individuals from Essex County, and I'm going to use Essex in quotation marks here because for a long time the historiography, the style was to just refer to them all as, those guys from Essex. So they sort of became somewhat famous in history as the Essex Men. At least 700 named Essex County men fought in the Battle of Menotomy. What's Menotomy? Menotomy is the rest of the day of April 19th. The troops marched from their bivouacs and their quarters, forced quarters on Boston proper, or Boston proper, went to Concord. Little stop in Lexington on the way. Then what happened? This is about what happened then. And maybe 700 more in Colonel Pickering's entire regiment. I could talk for a couple of hours just on what happened to Pickering and why did he pull up within sight of the retreating British columns. He was the one colonial commander that day who said, I don't have any orders. I should sit right here and figure out what the situation is. What in military parlance they call sitrep. What is the situational representation? What am I looking at? Nobody knew anything that day. He was the only one who exercised what an experienced military commander might have, maybe I should figure out what I'm getting into here before I attack. He was the only one. Now, for decades and decades after this, he was, shall we say, criticized because he was the only one that didn't throw his men into a bloody slaughter. But like I said, there's at least a couple of hours just to talk about what happened with Pickering. So why don't we know the names of the men of Essex County as well as we do the men of the Lexington Company, Captain Parker's men, the Brave 77, every one of them is named. And if you want to be a volunteer with the Lexington Minuteman Company, you have to be one of those 77. You can't just say, I'd like to be an extra. No, you portray an individual, a named person. How do we know the numbers? Well, some historian did the gut work, the crunch work of going to the Commonwealth Archives back in 1912, and would you believe, counting up expense vouchers, expense reports, the most pedestrian type of historical document left over after everything else. The Provincial Congress offered the men who served that day a certain number of shillings and pence for their service. Your company commander had to submit a receipt in order to get paid. So we have names. We have names at least of the men who served for the company commanders who submitted their expense reports, or, always to exercise the historian's judgment, who submitted something and that piece of paper survived. We can't tell them all, hey, Westford, you didn't show up, so you weren't there, or the Acton men. The Menotomy men from Arlington, they never submitted a voucher. Saying, please remit to Benjamin Locke, Solomon Bowman, and company. I think they were just too appalled at the bloodshed afterwards to do the paperwork of submitting an expense report. But we know who these captains were. They did submit their paperwork. I love what the National Park Service does, but in this regard, they are part of the problem. They tell their story, and they tell it exceedingly well. But in order to have some limits to what they tell, they draw some big brackets around their story. It had to happen on their grounds. And their grounds are confined to about this much area. There's Concord, a little bit, the Concord Bridge, North Bridge over the river, a little bit further off to the left on this map. North is the traditional up. And you can see this map, this clip ends at the visitor center. There's more of it to the right as you progress to the eastward. But the national park says, we tell the story of what happened here. And part of that is simply an accident of history. When the national park was created, these properties were available. This area was still primarily undeveloped, and farm fields, meadows, rough areas. They didn't have to evict a whole lot of people in order to create a national park. So that's what they did. They created the national park. They tell their story within their own bounds. But it ain't the whole story. This is a map from the American Battlefields Trust. The American Battlefields Trust exists to raise money and raise awareness and save from development those places that hold America's memories all over the country. They got started doing Civil War battlefields. Of course, they're exquisitely interested in what's left in the developed areas of the eastern parts of the country, especially the Northeast, and their map is a much better depiction of what on earth happened from about 9 o'clock on the night of April 18th, Tuesday, to the end of the day on April 19th. And it starts, as you see there, Boston, and it extends all over the map. It's about 16 miles from Boston to Concord. And about every other mile had something happening that day. The most of what happened, though, actually did not happen within the confines of the national park. It happened in Arlington. So that's the first historiographical issue in looking at this. And I promise that's the biggest word I'm going to use tonight. 7 syllables. It just means how you approach the topic. Is this about a control for a fight to control political authority, freedom of commerce? Is it, removing one economically dominant class and supplanting another one? Fashions come and go in history all the time, just like every other field of endeavor and a way of looking at things. So historiography, I think that noted historian Lin-Manuel Miranda came up with the best definition. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? It all depends upon that. For 200 more years, Lexington, the interests of Lexington, have fought the interests of Concord in telling this story. You think it's all hunky-dory right now and we're sort of at an agreed-upon peace, mostly. But from time to time, each one tries to assert its preeminence over the other. Do you know why our holiday in April is called Patriots' Day? It's because Lexington wanted Lexington Day. And they filed a bill in the legislature to do that, 1894. What do you think the Concord reps filed? Concord Day, immediately. Governor said, you guys are getting nothing unless you compromise. How about Patriots' Day? So that's why it's Patriots' Day. Patriots' Day was enacted into law in Massachusetts as a holiday, 1894, and it was specifically to compromise the competing interests of Lexington, the first shot, the birthplace of American liberty, you know, it's on all the signs, versus Concord, the shot heard round the world. Concord has the better poets. Lexington got Longfellow, though, to memorialize their story. So for a long time, they've been fighting about who's first. The memorials to the Essex Men's involvement are much more scattered than in one unified national park setting. You can't simply go someplace, find a guide or a docent and say, take me on a tour of what they contributed. The monuments are scattered geographically. They're also scattered in their literary sources. There's no single compendium that you could say, here is the story of the Essex County men on April 19th. So if anybody's looking for a master's thesis, it's still out there and could be written. A lot of it is documented in particular town-by-town histories. There have been a few of the more comprehensive views that have been taken, but not many, and not recently either. A guy by the name of Galvin took a comprehensive view of the military actions of the day. As you would see, as you would understand, he's a retired four-star general, and he used to be in charge of American forces in NATO. That's the way he looked at April 19th. And he brought in everybody in talking about tactics and communications. It's about 50 years old right now. You can see there was a real blip in publishing 50 years ago about this. But he's one of the few historians that have taken this sort of whole battlefield view. So there's a problem. And let's face it, for people who just have an interest in local history, the fact that the map keeps on changing, well, that can be a challenge. But you'll understand what I mean. The map keeps on, if you're from Arlington, you can understand the map changes all the time. Arlington was settled by its first Europeans and referred to as Cambridge Rocks, or the native Algonquian word. Don't ask me what it means because there's a lot of dispute about what Menotomy actually means. Menotomy, 1635. When there were enough people there to petition Old Cambridge to allow these folks living out on the fringe of the wilderness to have their own, well, basically to redirect their tax money to their own school and their own minister in their own church. This area known as Menotomy was accorded the political status of a precinct. Incorporated as a town in West Cambridge, 1807. 60 years later, Arlington. So we understand how the names on the map can change. If you're interested in jumping into this, and I'll give you a moment to take a picture if you want, these are some very informative, somewhat archaically written sources, but each one of them has proven more than not to be verified. It's not just a bunch of stories told and collected and, hey, I found a couple of the old timers at a tavern one day. What happened during the war, Grandpa? They're better than that. They're much better than that. Or simply take a snip of my email address and I'm happy to send you this as well as the online citations to these scanned volumes because you can't get them. One library will have one of them, one library will have two of them. You can't get them all in the same place. But thank you, Internet Archive. Thank you, Hathy Trust. And thank you, Library of Congress, they've scanned these, they've put them out there. It's free. With the Library of Congress, it is literally your tax dollars at work. All of this is available. This and more. There's a lot of great stuff out there online, and you can read the scans. I prefer HathiTrust to Library of Congress because Library of Congress makes you load up each page individually. HathiTrust will give you the 2-page image and you click and it flips like that. Much more convenient. Anyway, that's a style and flavor kind of thing. Essex County, once you start looking at these sources that were written in Essex about Essex County, you see right away that the coercive acts, that was the actual name in Parliament in London, the coercive acts. We are going to coerce Boston into behaving, and promptly termed the intolerable acts in the colonies, had just as heavy an impact on Essex County as they did the rest of Massachusetts. The 4 coercive acts: 1, close the port; 1, shut down the government. Although the elected representatives of the towns continued to meet, they decided simply to call themselves a provincial congress, and they kept right on meeting. And then they formed their own rogue committees, totally against the royal government, but they kept on going. The Quartering Act was another of the 4 coercives, and the Judicial Act, which said that if you're charged with a crime against the crown, you won't be tried in Massachusetts. You will be transported back to London to stand trial. If this sounds familiar, if this sounds like the recitation of the grievances that Thomas Jefferson put before the world to say why we 13 colonies are justified in declaring the king a tyrant and breaking all ties with him, this is it. This is where they stem from. These are the top 4. The coercive acts were just as bad, though, in Essex County. Think, shutting down the Port of Boston, biggest town in Massachusetts. What's that going to do to the trade in Salem or Lynn or Marblehead? It's literally going to make people starve. Because if your business is fishing and landing fish in Boston and selling it there, you don't have a place to do business anymore. The powder alarm drew men from Essex County. The powder alarm was the raid that worked and may have been the raid that made the British officers think, Concord, no problem. We can do this all over again. The powder alarm was the response of the colonials to seizing gunpowder that had been stored in what was then called Charlestown, today it's Somerville, in a powder house. And would you believe the location of this powder house? The building still stands in Somerville. It's called Powder House Square. And it's a rotary, so be real careful if you go there to visit, because there are a lot of visitors in the summertime who don't know about rotaries, but it's there, it still exists. The royal troops marched out of Boston in pre-dawn, got to Charlestown before the sun came up, waited around for sunrise, because nobody's going to light a candle in front of a powder house. They waited for the sun to come up, they went in, they took all the gunpowder that was still there, went back home again. The next day, 4,000 colonials with guns are marching towards the powder house because they think, this is it, the regulars are trying to subjugate us. But they were too late. So I'm sure that was still in the mind of the royal administration. And Marblehead, as tough as the drive can be to get from here to, down the highway, especially at rush hour, it's only 3 hours away by boat. If you catch the outgoing tide on your departure and you catch the incoming tide into Boston, you could actually commute. You could come down, do a day's business, and go. The economies of Marblehead, Lynn, Salem, and Boston were more closely connected than any other quadrant of towns on the coast. So the Marblehead guys that happened to be involved in this rogue government authorized by nobody except the provincial congress and their subcommittees, Because, you know, we're Americans, we love to create committees. This is de Tocqueville, fetched on this. We love to get together and have meetings and form groups and committees. The Provincial Congress creates a couple of committees. A committee of safety. Basically, that's going to be the War Department. A committee of supplies. They're going to be the Ways and Means. And yes, they published minutes. And the minutes have been transcribed and the minutes are available online. You can read the day-to-day actions of where they were, what town they were in, what they decided in that meeting. And these three elegant Marblehead gentlemen were key members of this government in quasi-exile, even though it was right there in Massachusetts. It wasn't the royal government, it was colonial government. From left to right, Elbridge Gerry. It's a Gary, not a Jerry, because it's a gerrymander when you totally wrench the political map to your own service, as he did in Essex County. He went on to be vice president under Madison. Azor Owen, noted merchant, and Jeremiah Lee, all of Marblehead. They were in Menotomy, April 18th, at one of these joint meetings of the committees of safety and supply. It was meeting in a tavern, as commonly was done. It was a place you could get everybody around a table. The hour grew late. They decided it's a long trek back to Marblehead. We'll stay overnight. They've got rooms. They stayed overnight, and the war came to them in the middle of the night. Although there is some question about what exactly happened, the story that comes out of Colonel Lee's biography in the 1840s is that Lieutenant Colonel Smith, charged with getting out to Concord as fast as he could, finding the two rebellious bastards who were in charge of the colonials, Hancock and Adams, Sam Adams, John Hancock and Sam Adams, took a detour and sent a platoon of his soldiers to bang on the tavern door. Because why? Because he had spies out that night? He knew that the committees of safety and supply had met there? It's only Jeremiah Lee's biographer that mentions this. So I'm not sure how much credence to give it. But the story that it tells is that the three of them were awakened by the innkeeper. Hey guys, there's an army marching up the road. Get out of here. And they go out the back window. And the three of them hide in the back fields on a cold April night in nothing but their night clothes. And as they said, the stubble corn was tall enough that if they laid down flat, they wouldn't be seen. And Jeremiah Lee literally catches his death of cold and dies in May. So do we believe the whole story that he went running out of this inn because the royal troops are onto him? Don't know. There's good evidence that says that they hid their valuables where they were sleeping, including a gold watch under the pillow. And the troops left the gold watch alone. So do you believe it? I'm not sure. It's a great story. There are some stories in history that are just so good, they don't stand up to. People have never asked the questions. Anyway, Gary, Orne, and Lee were some of the first Essex County men involved in the Battle of Menotomy, which really picks up slightly past 2 o'clock on April 19th. And the title for this section is, It Can Hardly Fail of Success. Like, easy peasy, guys. This will be no problem. And this reminds me of every email I've ever received at work from somebody above me saying, I have this absolutely lousy job for you to do, but you're the guy for it. It'll be fine. And that was the man for the job, Lieutenant Hugh Percy, probably His Majesty's finest soldier in North America. He really had the skill and the determination to make things happen. Unfortunately, he wasn't the one that Gage tapped to go out first that night. And this is the actual orders that Lord Dartmouth, His Majesty's Secretary for the North American Colonies, imagine putting that on your business card, sent to General Gage. You shall endeavor to arrest and imprison the principal actors and abettors in the Provincial Congress, that we know it's treason, that's rebellion, regardless of your, and in defiance, if they should presume again to assemble for rebellious purposes, and if the steps taken upon this occasion be accompanied with due precaution, and every means be devised to keep the measure secret until the moment of execution, it can hardly fail of success. Right? Sure. And will perhaps be accomplished without bloodshed. Well, we'll see how that turned out. So, Gage, if you want to hiss and boo, go ahead. You can hiss and boo right now. This is the most hated man in the colonies. This is the general who has evicted the duly elected governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and said, I am imposing royal will and royal rule directly on you. But in all fairness, I sympathize. He has a terrible job to do to try to keep the peace, even though he's got 4,000 troops by this point and the entire North American fleet. He's finding it more and more difficult to keep the rebellious sentiments in line. But he's a good company man. He follows orders, and he turns his orders over to Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, whose regular position is Colonel of His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot. Unfortunately, Smith had a less than stellar reputation amongst the ranks. The documentation of what happened on April 19th is spectacularly rich, even on the British side. And we have soldiers' diaries who write things like, can you believe they gave the command to Smith? He's too old, he's too fat, and too slow. But he's the one who was next up. He caught the assignment. And the assignment was to take the troops off Boston, which at this point in time is just this peninsula out into the harbor, hanging onto the mainland by Boston Neck, that 3 men could barely walk abreast at high tide and stay on dry land. That's how narrow Boston Neck was. It's an absolute pinch point. But you've got the British fleet. And I couldn't find a good image of HMS Somerset with its 70 cannon, but the HMS Agamemnon is the same size. Why do you need a battleship with 70 guns to keep the peace with a bunch of rebellious farmers? Well, we're going to find out in a couple of months what the Somerset can do. The Somerset is the virtual Death Star in the destruction of the town of Charlestown during the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was the shot from the fleet that burned the entire town of Charlestown and covered the attacking troops. This is the map of Isaac da Costa, Royal Engineer. It was published in London, I think in June or July of '75. And it sold big. It sold a lot of copies. You can see one of those copies in Boston at the Boston Public Library in the Leventhal Map Center. Norman Leventhal was a fabulously rich property developer with a passion for history and maps and all kinds of civic institutions. He collected maps. He collected original, authentic maps. They're all now at the Boston Public Library. You can look at an actual copy. This is more, though, than just a map. This really is an infographic because it's not just the depiction of the land and the natural features, but it's showing soldiers shooting at each other. Here they hid behind the fences. Percy marches towards Lexington. It really is trying to tell you the story of what happened that day. And I'm pretty sure right there, you see the number three underneath the battleship. That's 3 fathoms of depth. That would be the minimum amount of water to keep the Somerset afloat. So that's where the heavy guns were. That's what Revere had to keep from being blown out of the water by when he gets rowed across the harbor. So the troops land. They land in East Cambridge. They land on Phipps's farm. Phipps's farm was chosen because they thought Phipps was a loyalist and he wouldn't complain. Unfortunately, Phipps's farm ends in marshes. And before East Cambridge was filled in for factories, there were no docks there. So the boats pull up, they discharge the soldiers, and they're waist deep in water in the middle of the night in April. So that's the first problem. They have to wade ashore. And then they look around, and there aren't enough boats to get them all across in one movement. So the boats have to go back to Boston and row another bunch of soldiers across. When I've done this talk for various groups devoted to military history, veterans groups, I always say, this is the moment where snafu enters the picture. And anybody who remembers what snafu means, it's situation normal, all effed up. This whole expedition was snafu'd from the beginning. So they have to do two basically excursions over to get the troops to the other side. They march down into Old Cambridge. That's a lovely old print of Harvard College as it existed at the time of the Revolution. When Percy comes through with reinforcements, he takes somewhat the same route, but still different route, but still ends up in Harvard Square. He has to ask directions. And he finds somebody just walking that morning saying, "You fellow, which way is Lexington?" And the guy, he's a Harvard tutor, and he doesn't say, "Maybe this is the war we've been preparing for." I got 800 soldiers asking me where Lexington is. Over there. He says, over that way. They ran him out of town, and they didn't let him come back for a year. But eventually, the troops do make their way to Lexington. With all love for our friends and neighbors in Lexington, Lexington Green was an accident. It wasn't supposed to happen. Major Pitcairn rides up. He's the major of the Marines. It's his guys on the front line, and his first question is, who are these guys? These are farmers with guns, and they're lined up on their town common facing us at 5 in the morning? And he says, "Disperse, you rebels, lay down your weapons." And they don't. And then he says it again, and eventually they start to slink away. They don't lay down their weapons. Somebody fires. In the early 19th century, Americans love to point the finger at Pitcairn as he was the one that ordered the royal troops to begin their bloody massacre. Nobody really knows. The best analysis I've seen is that there were colonials who weren't part of Parker's company, but might have been hanging in their own homes by the windows facing Lexington Green with a loaded musket and an easy shot. A friend I know says, "I don't know who fired the first shot, but I know the first guy I'd like to talk to and ask about it." But anyway, they get to Lexington Green at dawn. If you've ever been to the reenactment, God love them, they do it at dawn. There is no reenactment in Lexington except as the sun comes up. So they fire a few shots at each other. The Royals, of course, slaughter 8 colonials, is it? Give themselves a mighty huzzah, and continue marching on to Concord, where they find precious little in terms of war material, but hey, it's the mission, we're going, and they burn it. The Acton men and the Concord men start talking amongst themselves, they're burning the town. And they decide to come down off Bowman's farm towards the bridge. And that's the Battle of Concord. It's really all, it's a skirmish. They shot, we shot again, they ran away. Like I said, I love these folks. I love the National Park Service, but that's all it was. And then, as DaCosta's map says, they have to start walking home. They are 16 miles into hostile territory at about 1 o'clock or so, 1:30 in the afternoon. They've already been shot up. Not so bad, but certainly not to the extent that they carried any kind of provisions for this. The general orders of the day were 30 cartridges. So 30 of the pre-assembled little packages that would include a musket ball and the powder that would go down the barrel of the musket with some left over to prime it. By the time they get into the open country, they're starting to take shots from all corners. Now, this map, the resolution is the best it can be because this is a 250-year-old map. This is a map drawn on the first day of the American Revolution, by all accounts, by Lord Percy himself. Why can we say that? It was found in his castle. Yes, the Percys still have a castle in Northumberland in England. It's Alnwick Castle. And in their files, the editor of American Heritage went over and said, I'd like to take a look. And the 12th Lord Percy said, well, I think I have some old things here. And they found this map. And it is a map of the route that Percy took after having relieved Smith and trying to get them back to safety. Right in the center, you see the sort of oblong object with a rounded top. That's the Powder House. It was the central landmark that he was writing down as to, here's where we were, and if we ever have to cross this countryside, here's where I'll need to remember. And up at the top right corner, Menotomy Meeting House, Adams Tavern a little bit over to the left. So this is a true depiction of what we know was there. On the top it says the Great Road from Cambridge to Menotomy, Massachusetts Avenue. That's it. Now, this is a map drawn by somebody who was literally either on foot or in the saddle and being shot at. So any level of detail that he puts in here, I think is amazing. But all the details that are in there are right. There's a hilly, broken ground in the middle, the Winter Hill neighborhood in Somerville. It's all there. The road to Woburn. Guess what it's called? Woburn Street, still today. In another corner, it says Colonel Royal's house, Isaac Royal, richest man in Massachusetts of the time, and a noted loyalist. His estate is still open. It's the Royal Slave Quarters and Estate today, and they do a fabulous job of telling both sides of the story, because the royal family money was made not in New England. New England was never the predominant economic engine of the British overseas colonies. It was the Sugar Islands. His fortune came from Antigua, where the enslaved labor had a lifespan of about 6 years. So they just kept bringing more of them over. They raised sugarcane. Sugarcane was refined into molasses. Molasses was turned into rum. And it all went around the Atlantic. And that's an even older theatrical reference from the movie 1776, molasses to sugar, molasses to rum. It really happened, and Isaac Royal profited fantastically by it. He made so much money, he was giving it away. He actually gave away a big chunk of it to Harvard. And he said, buy yourself a law professor or two. So Harvard Law School was founded on the money from Royal's Antigua slave-worked sugar plantations. They tore down that emblem a few years ago, and they rebranded. This did not happen. This was the typical sort of mid-19th century conception of Revere's ride. Revere was an important character that night, but he was only one. The really indispensable man was Dr. Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren. Who told Revere to go? Who set up the plan? Weeks in advance. Who said, Revere, come meet me. I have something I want to discuss with you. When I call you some night, I want you go across the harbor, don't get yourself shot from the battleships, and ride out to Concord. I won't give you any notice, but you've got to be ready when I call you. Dr. Warren set it all up. But Revere came riding through. He probably had, because he was Revere, he knew everybody. He was a member of the Masons and the trade associations, every sort of mechanics fraternal organization in Boston. He was a member. He was like my grandfather in the Rotary. He joined everything. He knew everybody. So when he came riding through Menotomy, he knew where Captain Locke lived, and he knew where Solomon Bowman, the lieutenant, lived, and I'm sure he knocked on their doors because he ran right by their houses. It was on the way. So yes, he did alert some people. Of course, we know he didn't make it all the way. He got captured. But other riders did make it. And other riders, you think of the second and third generation riders, they kept on going. They kept on going so far that that was the area that had the word that night. This comes from David Hackett Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride. It's about 30 years old now, but it was really the first modern attempt to pull together the story from all corners. And he sort of does this in mapping. It's called a chloropleth, where you use the different shades to indicate the degrees of time. All the different areas are shaded differently to talk about when the word was conveyed. And you see the white circle there around Waltham? There were British sentries on the roads around Waltham. So Waltham was never notified, not that night. They heard about it, of course, the next day. So anyway, the word goes far and wide.
They got all the way to Marblehead.
Yes. Yes, and if you read the locally written histories, they'll talk about a rider came through at 9 in the morning and our men formed up. You have to go, though, to that level because the rider isn't named and hasn't been memorialized in song and in story. But the locals said somebody came through at 9 in the morning and said the regulars killed people in Lexington. And that was all the message they needed because they'd been preparing for this. So I sort of reduced this to a table, and this is based on Fisher's information, which does not include Essex County, but I know the word got there. The furthest reach was about by late morning. All these towns, if you have any idea of where they're, we're talking Suffolk County, Middlesex County, Essex County, Norfolk County, Marlborough and Southmont, they're almost in Worcester County. That's by 9:30 in the morning. This is how the Battle of Menotomy happens, because the colonials were so well organized with their spy networks and their communication networks that if anything happened, they were going to spread the word. And this is how it happened. And the word went in all these different directions. Lord Percy collects what's left of Smith's command in Lexington at the Monroe Tavern, gives them 1 hour of rest because their tongues are hanging out. They have just had the worst day of their lives, and they don't even know what's coming next. So he gives them a quick R&R, get some water, bandage up the wounded. The Monroe Tavern in Lexington, I love them. It wasn't the field hospital, though. It was a place with room. It was a building that they could break into that had big rooms and floors. So they took it over as a field hospital. And by about 2 o'clock or so, they're marching out. So in time-honored Wikipedia style, here are our combatants so far. At Lexington Green, there were 700 Royal troops. Parker's Lexington Company, 77. No flag. They didn't have a flag. Well, Bedford says they had a flag. This is the Bedford flag, which Bedford swears up and down was carried by one of their militiamen just because he happened to have it in the closet that day. It had come down through his family. It's obviously old already by 1775. Bedford says, we carried it, and it was there. All right, so let's give him that. Vince aut morir, victory or death, victory or to conquer or to die. It's in silver satin, damask made of silk, and it's at Bedford Public Library in a very darkened alcove if you want to go see it. By about 3:30 o'clock, the Royal troops are taking more fire than they ever imagined. Gage's after-action report says it was like a moving circle of fire. Remember, this is somebody who's spent his career in the military, And the way you train soldiers back then in the world's most feared land army is you line up, shoulder to shoulder, in ranks, 1, 2, 3. First rank kneels, load, fire, drop back. Second rank, move up, kneel, fire. Third rank, time after time. And you're doing this because the inaccuracy of one smoothbore musket is pretty much canceled out if you have 50 of them firing at the same time at a small target. The lethality of a Brown Bess or the typical sort of pattern 1765 that were common at this point in time, and believe me, the military antiquarians, the weapons collectors, they really are into all this. They've actually done field tests like Mythbusters, where they shoot at stuff with replica weapons, and they're deadly to 70, 80 yards. Maybe 100 if it's a really well-produced piece. There was an awful lot of variation in the quality of the weapons. Lethal at 70 to at least 70 yards, maybe to 100 yards. And so having an entire rank of soldiers firing them at once, that's simply the way they did it. But not the colonials. The colonials are circling, running through the woods and shooting at the column of royal soldiers, and the royal soldiers simply cannot deal with it. Not because they are massively outgunned, which they would be if the colonials all came together, they never did, but because they just can't tell where the fight is. It's invisible. It's an infantryman's worst nightmare. The shots are coming in from all directions, and there's no place to take cover. There's no shelter. Another letter from another soldier. We were most annoyed at a village called Menotomy. No points off for spelling. Having no shot to fire from our cannon on the houses which were full of men. So we have first-hand accounts saying they're shooting at us from the houses. This explains, at least in military terms, why, as the battle rolls through Menotomy, the royal soldiers are taking the fight into the houses. Anything, anybody, anything that moves, anything that they can spot, anything in this roadway, anything in that area that Percy sketched. If it's not a royal troop, it's a target. They're not going to ask questions. They're going to shoot. They're going to shoot at anybody they see. Richard Pipes's little book of notes says the handwriting's not actually all that bad. Reading the top excerpt from midway through the first line. Our orders, do you see where I'm reading there? The top line. Our orders of march, our order of march was then formed for Boston. The light infantry and grenadiers in the center, with strong detachments from each battalion as flankers. This is how an 18th century army moves through hostile territory. You've got your van of soldiers in the middle. You've got flankers on the edges to try and protect you from wherever the shooting's coming from. As flankers, and in each regiment taking the van and, next excerpt, and rear guards in turns. When they got exhausted, they were spelled out. We had not marched 200 yards. This is after Percy collects them all in East Lexington. We had not marched 200 yards till we received a hot fire from all sides, and in this manner fought our way back through a strong, close country, every wall lined, every house filled with wretches who never dared show their faces. And in one artist's depiction, it could have looked something like this. The royal troops still bunched together, the colonials surrounding them from all sides, although I don't think the colonials ever formed up in units even that close. It truly was total disbursement. British Fusilier, this is the, Frederick Mackenzie's diary. Mackenzie's great. Mackenzie tells you exactly what he thinks of his commanding officers. Not much. The highlighted areas, for they were all lined with people who kept an incessant fire upon us, as we did too upon them, but not with the same advantage, for they were so concealed there was hardly any seeing them. In this way we marched between 9 and 10 miles. That's right. That's about what it takes to get from Lexington almost to the Boston Peninsula again. Their numbers increasing from all parts, while ours was reducing by deaths, wounds, totally surrounded with such an incessant fire, it's impossible to conceive. Our ammunition was likewise near expended. So they're becoming desperate. They're running out of ammunition as they continue to take fire from all sides. Gage toned it down a little bit when he had to write back to London and say, here's what happened. On our leaving Concord, to return to Boston, they began to fire on us from behind the walls, ditches, trees, etc., which as we marched increased to a very great degree, continued without an intermission of 5 minutes, altogether for, I believe, upwards of 18 miles. Yeah, Concord's about 18 miles outside the harbor. 18 continuous miles of taking fire. So I can't think, but it must have been a preconcerted scheme. This is where Gage is trying to do a little bit of political covering of himself. They planned this. We marched into an ambush. They didn't. It was entirely spontaneously generated. There was no joint command, but there was joint purpose amongst the American leaders. And so, even though they only had this short time, they were able to raise such a numerous body and for so great a space of ground because of the spies. According to Frank Warren Coburn, who did that analysis of the expense reports, the muster rolls, in 1912, he counts these companies as having shown up for the battle in Menotomy. The numbers afterwards are the number of companies for each one of these towns. So 3 companies of men from Beverly. A company could have been anything from 17 or 20 men to 60. 60 was the prescribed top. But you could have had companies with smaller numbers, especially if they just marched to the sound of the guns as soon as they got the word that morning. And by the time we roll into Menotomy, the Royal soldiers are represented by this flag. That was the Union flag before Ireland was incorporated with a little extra red stripe on each of the diagonals in 1801. So between 14 and 1,800 soldiers. I'm going to give the colonials the pine tree flag at this point because we know it was being used by ships coming out of Maine in the 1760s and the 1770s. So let's give them that flag as their ensign. There are so many stories of what the colonials recorded as the atrocities of the day that we have to focus on a very limited space here. Fortunately, a lot of the stories of the day converge on one location. This is the Jason Russell House in Arlington, pretty close to Arlington Center, built about the 1740s by, guess who, Jason Russell, who was the grandson, great-grandson, and third great-grandson of other people named Jason. But this was Jason's house, and we figure it's the 1740s because his grandfather died. He got married, and it was a good time to build a new family, a new house. But there are parts that have been dated to much older. The rings in the biggest beams that hold up the floors of the second story have been dated through tree ring analysis to the 1680s. So they recycled part of Grandpa's house when they tore it down and they built this one. At Jason Russell's house, it would seem, if you read the account, all the forces collapsed on this one place. Here's a map of Menotomy pretty much as it existed in the 1770s. I'm going to give you a blow up. The red road is the battle road, Massachusetts Ave today. The blue road goes to Watertown called the Watertown Road on one end and Mystic Street on the other. It's still there. It runs from Watertown on one end and up past the Mystic Lakes on the other. It's Pleasant Street, or Route 60. So let's focus in just a little bit more. Jason Russell's house was right there in the center of town. Why did all these troops collapse on Menotomy Village? Menotomy Village was very centrally located. It had roads going out to all points of the countryside. I think because Menotomy had a brook, a very fast-running brook called the Mill Brook today. And in the early 1600s, it was being used for mill power. Certainly in the 18th century, all the roads went out to where the customers would bring in their grains from. So everybody knew how to get to Menotomy, including these folks. Sometimes, I had to throw this in just for fun, sometimes we get Russell descendants who want to tour the house. This was July 4th, and it was my privilege to show Kurt Russell of the Hollywood Russells, and his son, Boston, who are 8th and 9th generation descendants of the family. And they had themselves a fabulous time going through the exhibits. The thing that I heard Kurt say the most often was, "Boss, come look at this. Boston, you gotta take a look at this." But the events of the day were much more horrific on April 19th of 75. Let's bring in some more of the Essex men. Timothy Monroe and Daniel Townsend. They were part of this group that was trying to defend the Jason Russell house with Jason. And they were all slaughtered because the Russell house is right on the road and the flankers were coming in behind it. So this is their first-person account of what happened as they were coming down the road in the retreat towards Boston. Townsend had just fired and exclaimed, "There's another redcoat down," when Monroe, looking round, saw to his astonishment that they were completely hemmed in by the flank guard. Dropped down to the third to bottom line. All this time, which was indeed but a moment, the balls were pouring through the back windows, making havoc of the glass. Townsend leaped through the end window, carrying the glass. He basically busted out the window as he jumped through it. Townsend leaped through the end window, carrying the sash and all with him, and instantly fell dead. Monroe followed and ran for his life. So here's a first-person account of two guys who were in the house. One of them was killed. One of them barely got out with his life, and he said 32 bullet holes through his clothing and hat. Do we believe it? I believe it. Because if you look at the house head on, and then do an examination with some very fancy laser optics, and you line up all the evidences of the musket ball strikes, those were the paths of the ones that we can tell today. The Russell family continued to live there until the 1880s. So of course they covered up a lot of stuff in the succeeding generations. But this is the evidence that still survives. All those white lines represent the paths of musket balls going through or into or coming into the house. This white one that's right here, we're looking head on, the little white one, that's somebody standing in the front hallway and shooting up at somebody on the stairs. The ones on the right are coming in through the windows and walls facing Battle Road. The one on the left, that's from the orchards. That's the orchards out behind the house. This one's coming in from that south. Those two close parallel ones, those are shots fired from inside the kitchen at people who had gone down to take shelter in what they thought was the basement. It wasn't a basement. It was a door that led to a trap in the floor. But some guys got down there and they survived. A whole lot of colonials did not.
How were those assessments made?
They were made with the same sort of fancy analysis that crime reconstruction experts do. You find the evidence, you put the markers, you determine the pathways.
It still had some holes in the walls or whatever.
Yeah, and a very experienced eye could find many more than even the guides there could tell. A typical tombstone would relate, or headstone would relate year of birth, year of death, family members. This is Jason Russell's, and I've written out the inscription. This is not the way you normally find a headstone engraved in a colonial cemetery. Barbarously murdered in his own house by Gage's bloody troops on the 19th of April, 75, Itatis, at the age of 59. He's probably 58, but his body is quietly resting in this grave with 11 of our friends who, in like manner, with many others, were cruelly slain on that fatal day. Blessed are the dead who died in the Lord. 5 minutes. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to bring in some more of the Essex people who were also similarly slaughtered. This is the old burying ground. Every colonial town has an old burying ground. This is the one in Arlington. That obelisk is from 1848. If you think Bunker Hill, if you think Washington Monument, you're seeing this was the architectural trend and fashion of the time. It has plaques on it but the plaques have somewhat incomplete information. The one in marble that dates to 1848, 9 American soldiers killed at Menotomy, April 1775, and buried here. And they list off the names, including, but midway down, William Flint, Thomas Hadley, Abednego Ramsdell of Lynn, and then Benjamin Pierce of Salem. The DAR came along in 1941 and put a fuller plaque on the other side of everybody in the cemetery who served in the Revolutionary War. Abednego Ramsdell is remembered in Swampscott, not far from here. Putnam, yeah, in Peabody, yep. Outside the Old Bell Tavern, Washington, and not sure the other street. As you can see, again, obelisk, Egyptian themed, period photograph, known in the archives though as the Lexington Monument. So what's the significance? The fact that so many soldiers converged on Menotomy in one place scared the hell out of the royal troops. It was nothing that they expected. They thought they were facing an army. The colonials told the story, of course to advantage themselves, of slaughter and barbarity. The soldiers who were fighting for the crown were talking about surviving and shooting at targets. Same battle, completely different viewpoints. The word got to John Adams about 2 days later. He then went back down to Philadelphia, where he joined the Second Continental Congress. And he argued, and he's as obstreperous as all of the accounts in literature, he convinced them, you can't deny, we have an army. We can talk about independence later, but we have an army right now. Are we going to abandon them? Congress decides to adopt, and I use that word, adopt the army in Cambridge, because that's where Artemus Ward and General Heath, William Heath, had set up their command. We are going to adopt them as a continental army. And they actually vote funds to bring in additional companies from around the 13 colonies, including some expert marksmen with that new technological development called a rifle. 6 companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, specifically. So Congress is going to spend money now to support an army. If you have an army, you've got to have leaders. The next day, Adams keeps at it. He says, I've got the guy. I know who should be in charge of this army. Oh, June 14th is the day that the U.S. Army considers to be their birthday. They just celebrated their big 250th. Adams goes back to Congress and says, I got the guy. His name is, and John Adams is sitting there thinking, it's my moment, George Washington? Because he knew he had to get the sympathies of the southern colonies in order to make this a continental army. And Congress says, ask Washington if he'll do it. He says yes. He accepts the commission. He comes up from Washington. He takes command of the Continental Army. If you're ever in Cambridge and you're visiting, you're doing a walking tour of Harvard Square, there's the big common, and there's the hotel on the side of the common called the Sheridan Commander. I lived in Cambridge for decades before I realized the Sheridan Commander is right across the street from where Washington accepted command of the Continental Army. We now have an army and a chief officer. We're this close to declaring revolution because of some 4,000 colonials, including from here, Essex County, that came to the battle and didn't go home afterwards. And I'll leave a few minutes for questions at that point.
Can you go to the slide of the Ramsdell monument that you...
Ramsdell, sure.
So I'm going to say very few people in Swampscott knows that exists.
Yeah.
Why is that? What can you say?
Well, no stories or songs or movies about Abednego. Do I say that right? I thought it was Abednego. Abednego, and his brothers were Shadrach and Meshach. And if you have any clue where those three names are found together, Book of Daniel, 10 points to Gryffindor. Yes. 3 brothers. And they were his brothers too. Now, he was one more guy that day who answered the call. And he ended up getting killed when all of the converging forces collapsed on this really futile attempt at turning a pile of old shingles in Jason Russell's backyard into a redoubt. It would never have worked. He was a dead man. In fact, Russell's nearest friend, Amy Cutter, said, "Get out of here. We're going up the hill. You know, right back up there past your apple trees." And Jason supposedly grumbled something like, "An Englishman's house is his castle." And they're probably the last words he ever said. But the Cutter family wrote them down, and they've continued that tradition of that's what he said. So, any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can say it's just another guy that got killed, but he got 20 lines of text in a single monument that very few people have.
That's true, and as Nancy introduced me, one of the thrills that I get about researching and telling these stories is pulling stuff out that at one point was so well known that the old Essex chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, not the daughters, but the sons, they paid for that and they put it there. And it's a very nicely little landscaped area.
Is that 1930?
1929. 29.
What was the
Third plantation was that the designation for Swampscott? Lynn begat Linfield, begat other places. I mean, I had to actually write down a genealogy. The Newburys were easy. Newbury became West Newbury and Newburyport. Salem became Danvers. What? Lynn became a whole bunch of towns. But it was known as Lynn, so the first accounts. So part of the confusion is that who did he fight for? Did he fight for Lynn? Did he fight for Swampscott? There was no Continental Army. Did he fight for a particular company? That's basically the only marker that we have on some of these guys. They were following a particular captain or colonel. And he was one more guy. In fact, at the Jason Russell House, that obelisk was erected in 1848 when they finally had the names of all the people that they had buried in the open pit. Because the dead from Jason's house that day, they were all just thrown into a common grave as fast as they could be. It took 73 years to actually put some of their names on stone. And some of them, some of the ones who were exhumed later proved what people said afterwards. They were buried in the clothes that they died in. Yes?
Did the Continental Army, they weren't an army yet, did the people of Massachusetts, did they know that the British were going out to Concord ahead of time? I mean, that's when
No.
Revere said
There had been
British are coming,
there had
we
been
have an
rumors,
idea
there had been speculation. There had also been a network of people who swore to each other, as soon as I hear, I'll tell you. So when the first word passed before dawn that morning, everybody took the word one more step outwards. And they figured that they were marching towards Concord because they're on the Great Road. I mean, there's only one, there are two places that road goes to back in 75. It goes to Lexington and it goes to Concord. Concord was known as where Hancock's relations, his father and grandfather had lived, and they figured that's where they were hiding. No, there's no way to roll back time and say they knew it. They didn't. They were just ready for that and all other possibilities.
Thanks.
One more I think we have time for, and then I promise.
Can I just clarify, this is very interesting and informative and complex
And I left out half of it.
One thing, because you're going to get this at history camp, can I just clarify one thing about the gunpowder raid in Somerville?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But in February, there was no gunpowder involved. And the title of the book that was written a few years ago was wrong. It's all about cannon.
Mhm.
No gunpowder, so you might want to
Just canning?
put that up there. And so it wasn't a powder.
Okay, I've read some things that said that the colonials had removed most of the gunpowder already.
Yeah, there was a lot of it, but they're saying cannons were the big thing.
And there are a couple of historians that are saying 4 cannons caused the American Revolution,
Yeah, exactly.
and the hunt for those 4 cannons.
So you might want to keep that in mind as there's that bigger.
When I talk to
Because
you
you're
know,
gonna do it
when I
anyway.
talk to youth audiences, kids in school, I tell them we haven't answered all the questions yet. There is so much still to learn. There are disagreements, there are gaps, there are sources. You can play along with this too. It is wonderful, it is entertaining, and it's our story. It's all of our stories. So, I'll give it back to you.
I want to invite you all to sample some lovely cookies and converse very briefly. And then we have to sort of be out of here by 8:30, right?
8:20 and
8:20, okay.
gets tight.
So eat your cookies quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for coming.
And I need to get your W-9.
I think it's in my bag.
Sorry.
Excellent idea. Excellent. Yeah. Here,
All right.
thank you. I'm very appreciative. I was happy to put this together.
This will take until
oh,
this week.
thank you.
That's half of it tonight.